It's well known that the Pyro element is heavily oversaturated with on-field DPS characters. Considering we got two of them this patch with mavuika's first banner and arlecchino's first rerun, plus getting Seat Lally as a huge increase to many Pyro DPS, now is a perfect time to look back at every Pyro DPS and see which of them are the strongest. Let's get started. So for this, I'm going to be going in order of worst to best, and placing each character in a lettered tier from D to S. I will also only be covering 5-star characters in this video, because I don't really care about the 4 stars. And starting from the bottom, it should be no surprise to see Daya, as she just is not good at all. As a DPS, Daya has short uptime with a long cooldown, and during that short uptime, her skill is disabled so she can't even catch her own particles, resulting in her having very high energy requirements. And her damage during her DPS window is very low as well, so it's not worth the trade-off at all. Dea does have constellations that fix most of her issues and increase her damage by a lot, but because her baseline is so low, even at Constellation 6, Dea deals less damage than what most other Pyro DPS do at C0, so she goes definitively at the bottom of the list in D tier. Next on the list is Yoimiya. When it comes to Yoimiya, it's pretty well known just how many problems she has. For starts, her damage is basically entirely single target. Having issues with AoE is not an uncommon problem for Pyro DPS, but even others with AoE issues such as Hu Tao are still capable of hitting more than one enemy with proper positioning. But Yoimiya is not, and there's nothing you can do about it. And even with a team where Yoimiya is buffed by the entire team like a hyper carry and getting vaporized, her damage is lower than basically everyone except Klee and Dea. And on top of that, Yoimiya is a ranged DPS, so she has innately low interruption resistance. Saying just dodge is not a valid argument with Yoimiya, because if you dodge, you mess up which hits and her combo will vaporize, so she's basically guaranteed to lose damage no matter what you do. Historically, Yoimiya's shielded teams have been a lot lower theoretical DPS than playing shieldless, but fortunately we now at least have Lanyan who gives her a shield option that isn't super far behind. However, it's not nearly enough to make up for the fact that it's still purely single target damage, and lower than that of other Pyro DPS that also have AoE. Making matters worse, Yoimiya was released at a time our constellations were very hit or miss, and hers were a miss, as they are all extremely underwhelming. In fact, her C6 can actually be a DPS loss due to messing up her Vaporize. So overall, I'm going to put Yoimiya at the bottom of C tier. She's definitely better than Dea, but I don't think she's better than anyone else. Next up, we have Klee. Now with Klee, she was actually a pretty darn good DPS for a while, so we do have to put some respect on her name. Originally, she had her Mono Pyro team, and then improved in Fontaine by replacing Zhongling with Farina and vaporizing Farina's damage. But even though Klee's team sheeted decently well for the times, she never had a positive reputation due to most players finding her very awkward and clunky to play, on top of being easily staggered. And with the massively increased standards we've gotten in natlan, the output and DPS of Klee's teams just doesn't hold up that well anymore. So with that, and her gameplay issues in mind, I'm going to place Klee into C tier above Yoimiya. Yoimiya has higher single target than Klee, but Klee has plenty of AoE and actually has useful constellations unlike Yoimiya, so that warrants her a spot above. You could argue that Klee could go up to the bottom of B tier instead of C, but I'll keep her here. And then next we have the Pyro Traveler. Considering Traveler's kits are usually pretty terrible, it might be surprising to see them above Klee and Yoimiya. But Pyro Traveler is surprisingly decent. Their multipliers are alright, not high but not low either. They give themselves a good amount of self buffs, while being able to use the very powerful Obsidian Codex DPS set. Pyro Traveler can even front load a few 100,000 damage by vaporizing their burst. In a team like an Overvape team with Aura Run, or a Vaporized Plunge team, Pyro Traveler sheets a decent bit higher than Yoimiya while having AoE, even if not particularly excelling at it. Plus, Pyro Traveler is a free character and doesn't require you to spend any resin on bosses to level, freeing up those Primo Gems and resin to be spent elsewhere, such as on the supports. Because of these factors, I say Traveler fits solidly into B tier. Now, I can already smell the dislikes coming from a mile away for the next character, but I stand by it. Next is Hu Tao. For the majority of Hu Tao's time in this game, she has been widely accepted as one of the strongest DPS in the game, as she consistently got new support to help her keep up with the ever-evolving meta. So, why isn't she higher on the list? While Hu Tao is still certainly a very strong DPS, she has quite a few problems holding her back. Firstly is her lack of AoE. She's by no means as bad as someone like Yoimiya in AoE, but her AoE performance is still underwhelming, definitely below average. And then at Constellation Zero, she has really bad stamina issues that can make her feel really awful to play. Some people think that this isn't a problem anymore because you can use Zhang Yun and do the plunge team without stamina issues, but the problem with that is, Plunge Tao is considerably weaker than using Bennett or Shilonin, and you could have just pulled Hu Tao C1 instead of Zhang Yun, making her way stronger at the same time as fixing the stamina issue, so Plunge Hu Tao is a completely moot point. Hu Tao also has a bit of an awkward problem with the healer slot on her team, as she has to pick between Bennett and Shilonin. With Bennett, Hu Tao will do way more damage, but with Shilonin, Hu Tao's damage takes a big hit due to not getting the Pyro Scroll buff, in exchange for buffing the Hydro units by a lot. Should Hu Tao in the future get a healer that is good at buffing both her and the Hydro units at the same time, that would do her wonders. But as she stands right now, and with how most of the other units have improved a lot with Seed Lali, I'm going to place Hu Tao at the bottom of A tier. And next we have Linny, and Lenny is a unit that opinions are pretty mixed on. His damage output and DPS have always been pretty darn good, but the problem is he has seen as yet another single target Pyro DPS, and he can be easily interrupted out of his charge shots, which causes him to lose a lot of damage when it happens. But at 5.3 we got both Lali and Lanyan, giving him strong shielded teams. With Lali, he can use her alongside mavuika to melt Mavuika's burst for huge front-loaded AoE damage, then you'll consistently have a Pyro Aura applied to the enemies for Linny to get his 100 damage bonus buff. This team kills two birds with one stone, allowing Linny to both play with a shield and have a great source of AoE damage, without being weaker than his non-shielded teams. But you can make the argument that this team is being carried hard by Mavrika and would be better without Linny on the team, so it can hardly be called a Linny team. And that's a fair argument, and in that case, he does still have his Vaporized team with Lanyan now. This team has similar DPS to Hu Tao's best teams, and isn't much weaker than Linny's non-shielded Vaporized teams, while not only having a shield, but also being able to use grouping with Lanyan's burst. Having access to that grouping is really nice, because while Linny is known as being single target, his burst and skill have pretty good AoE and deal a ton of damage, so after getting enemies grouped up, he can do huge AoE nukes. So the release of Lanyan has heavily mitigated Linny's two biggest criticisms. On top of that, he has very powerful constellations, so he can continue scaling higher and higher. So why isn't Linny higher on this list? It's mainly because his pyro application is too frequent for him to forward melt his damage, so he can't use Seat Lali the way the remaining characters can. Forward melt is just a way bigger multiplier than reverse vaporize, so not being able to do this means Linny is simply not capable of doing as high of damage as those that can. So overall, Linny goes into A tier, right above Hu Tao. Up next is a character that might be very surprising to see this high, D-Luke. D-Luke is one of those characters that got improved very well with Seed Lolly, since plunge attacks don't have ICD, and you can space them out so that Seed Lolly's cryo application is sufficient. In the hands of an experienced plunge the Luke player, he can do 7 melted plunges, allowing him to deal nearly 2 million personal damage per rotation, while being one of the few DPS units with team DPS over 100,000, which is way higher than any of the other characters covered so far. And see, Lowly's cryo application is AoE, while plunged attacks also have pretty good AoE, so Diluc avoids that single target issue that some of the other Pyro DPS have. Diluc's constellations basically don't do anything in his plunge team, but that's hardly an issue for his vertical scaling when Jian Yun and Seed Lowly's constellations are so strong. However, if you aren't quite as experienced at playing Diluc in a plunge team, you'll likely only get 6 plunges and not 7, which puts his damage and DPS more in line with the likes of Liddy and Hu Tao. Luke also can't afford to use his burst in this team without messing up the melts, so the team won't function without C6 Bennett. For all of these reasons, I placed the Luke above Lineage 2 Tao in A tier, but beneath the three remaining characters. And the next character is one very similar to the Luke. It's that boy Jamal. Others call him Gaming, but real ones know his name is actually Jamal. Like the Luke, Jamal benefits greatly from Seat Lally thanks to being able to melt all of his damage. And in my opinion, Jamal is almost entirely superior to the Luke here, assuming of course you have his constellations. The reason why Jamal benefits so much more than the Luke here is, his plunges are already naturally spaced out by needing to wait for his lion to return to him. So you can do a normal combo of 5 lion plunges on him, not really sacrificing anything, compared to the Luke going from 8 plunges in Vaporize to 7 or 6 in Melt. Plus, Jamal casts his skill multiple times, so he gets all 3 stacks of Crimson Witch, while the Luke gets at best 1 in this team. Because of this, a C6 Jamal's damage is higher than the Luke's even if the Luke gets 7 plunges, and Jamal also has more AoE since his C6 increases his AoE to the same size as Zhao's. So since he's basically a better Diluc, Jamal goes right above him in A tier. I actually considered placing him higher on this list, but he is a burst reliant DPS that can end up in awkward positions if you don't have his burst up by the time you swap to him. And I'd say that holds him back enough to not be placed any higher than this. And up next we have Arlecchino. Arlecchino benefited way more from Seat Lally than I expected, since she can actually melt with solo Cryo Seat Lally if you do in-3D as her combo. This gives her extremely high damage and team DPS, but funnily enough, it's actually a bit lower than Jamal and D-Luke. So why is she higher than them? Well, she's higher than the Luke because her DPS is a lot higher if you can't get 7 plunges on the Luke, whereas getting all of Arlecchino's normal attacks is pretty easy. And compared to Jamal, Arlecchino is completely not reliant on her burst, whereas he is very dependent on his burst, which can be a big detriment in some scenarios. Flinching is also just a playstyle that many people find very off-putting and not as strong in practice as it is in theory. Furthermore, Arlecchino has very overtuned constellations, so her damage can scale way beyond the Luke and Jamal's with investment. The main downside with Arlecchino is that she can die easy and be staggered pretty easy as well, but with Seed Lally this is mitigated by her shield, though you do still have to be careful since Seed Lally's shield isn't that strong. Arlecchino's other main downside is that she isn't super spectacular in AoE. She's definitely better in AoE than someone like Hu Tao. I'd say she's a bit above average in AoE, but she's still not exactly an AoE DPS. Nonetheless, Arlecchino's strengths are still high enough for me to place her at the very top of A tier. And last but not least, we obviously have mavuika. She is not only the best Pyro DPS in the game, but she's without question the strongest DPS in the entire game, and it's not even close. Mavrika is just extremely overtuned. She deals way over 2 million damage per rotation at Constellation 0, basically stronger than a C2 Arlecchino while C0. Then a C2 Mavrika is as strong, if not stronger, than a C6 Arlecchino. She does this while having basically none of the flaws of the other Pyro DPS. She can't be interrupted during her burst at all, she has massive circular AoE with her charged attacks, has absurd front load on her burst cast, and while Mavuika is burst reliant, the fighting spirit mechanic lets her get her burst up much easier than characters that use energy. Then as mentioned, her constellations still let her scale way farther beyond. So yeah, Mavrika goes as the only character in S tier, as I can't justify any of the other characters being in the same tier as her, when she's just so much better than them at everything. And yeah, that's everyone. I'm sure this will be a bit of a controversial video, as any ranking or tier list type of videos always are, but regardless of any disagreements, I am very curious to see what you guys think, so leave your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, as it helps me out a lot. Also, feel free to join my Discord where you can communicate with me and my community directly. Thanks, and goodbye.